In today's video, I'm going to be doing a tutorial on an animation that's been requested quite a bit, and that is this inflated balloon text. As always, you can get the project files on my Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal. Initially, when I made this, I followed this tutorial, and although it's a great tutorial, it doesn't really go into the specifics of why you select certain numbers and really just the process behind it, which is why I wanted to make a video on it as well, because as always, it's nice if you can follow a tutorial, but it's so much better if you actually understand what you're doing so you can adjust and change different settings to get the exact look that you're going for. At the end of the day, what we want is to learn how to actually do something and not just being able to follow. I also want to give a little bit of insight into how I took the animation from Blender, rendered it out, took it into After Effects, added a little bit of source, and then sound designed it as well with the help from today's video sponsor, Artlist. With that being said, let's hop straight into Blender. In Blender, I've just opened it up. I'm just going to hit the general and we'll just start from the basic square one. And we'll get all the basics set up. I'm just going to hit A to select everything and then X to delete it. Now we can start setting up our scene. First thing we're going to do though is just change the render engine to cycles and then change it to experimental, and GPU compute just works a little bit better for me. And then I'm just going to decrease the samples of the viewport to something like 20 because we don't need that many, and then the render samples to something like 200, and then we'll experiment with that later. And then one last thing is just changing the frame rate to 23.98. It's just going to make it easier to match it with footage, because whenever you shoot on a camera, that's typically what it is, at least if you're in the US. If you're in Europe, it's 25. Now we can go ahead and create our text. So I'm just gonna hit Shift A, which is gonna bring up this add menu, which is the same as going up here. Doing the shortcuts is just quicker. So we are gonna create our text layer, and I'm just gonna hit Tab, which normally goes into edit mode, but for text, it's a little bit different as it just lets you edit the text. So in this case, I'm just gonna put Artlist, since they are sponsoring this video, shout out to them. And what we're going to do here is just set up our text exactly how we want it. Once we've done that, we're going to convert it into a mesh, which means we can't change it again. So you want to make sure that you get it exactly how you want it. I'm going to open up the font, and then I'm going to change it to the same font as the example, which is Unifractor. Just a cool little looking font. And let's just scale that up a little bit by hitting S and just dragging. And then I am going to add some extrusion to it by going into geometry and just increasing the extrusion a little bit to get it how I want. I think that looks pretty good, and then just add a little bit of bevels to it as well to give it a little bit more of a rounder feel, and maybe increase the character spacing to something like 0.12. Just gives me a little bit breathing room between it all. But this is where we are going to turn it into a mesh, and that means you can't change it again. So we're going to right click and then convert to a mesh. And now if I hit Tab, we no longer can change the text, it just turns into a mesh. Now this mesh is not the cleanest, so to make our life a little bit easier, we're gonna go and add a remesh modifier. We're just gonna clean that up a little bit, and we're gonna go to Sharp and then remove disconnected, uncheck that, so we still get everything that isn't touching, and just increase the octet depth until your text looks pretty good. So in this case, 8 looks super solid. And then with my mouse hovering over this, I'm gonna hit Control A, which is going to apply that. Now I want to set up my text, so I'm going to right click and then go to set origin to center of mass, and then by hitting Alt G, it'll take that and center that right in the middle of our scene. Now before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm going to save the project to make sure that just in case anything crashes or I regret doing something, I have a save. So super important to do that, especially when working with simulations, because sometimes it does crash. Now that we have that saved, I'm going to hit Shift A again to add a mesh, and then this time we're going to add a plane, which is going to be our floor. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to hit S again to scale it up, and I'm just going to make it pretty big. Since this will be our background, you can always make it transparent if you don't want to see it in the render itself, but we do need it so that our text doesn't float or fall into the abyss. I'm going to select my text, I'm going to hit G to bring up the position tool, and if you just move your mouse around, it'll move every which way, but then if you hit Z, you can just move it up and down, and we just want to place it right above our plane, so there's just a little bit of space floating about. Now we are going to select our text, and we are going to create the deflated state. Doing that using the cloth physics, so I'm just going to add a cloth physics thing to it. But before we mess too much with that, we're also going to add a physics modifier to our ground, which is a collision modifier, and then I'm going to turn off single-sided, and that just means that when our text falls down, when it deflates, it doesn't go through the floor, it just lays on there nicely. Clicking back to our text, we are going to mess a little bit with the settings. First thing I'm going to do is increase the vertex mass just to make sure that it falls down. Something between 3 and 5 usually works pretty well, but you want to play around with these settings depending on the size of your text and all that. So It might be a little bit different for you in terms of the values, so it just takes a little bit of playing around, but between 3 and 5 should be pretty good. So let's just put 4. And one of the most important things here is to increase the bending. I found something like 30 and 40 works pretty good, so I'm just gonna set that to 40. Increase the stiffness just a little bit to something like 20, 20, 20, and that should be pretty good. And then the next thing we're gonna do is go into collisions, enable self collisions, and just decrease this number to, well, essentially just adding an extra 0, so 0.0015, hit enter, and then go into cache, and then we just need a couple of frames. We don't need to calculate the simulation for the whole sequence, which is 250 frames as it is right now. We can set it to something like 20, 30, 50, something like that. We just need it to deflate our text a good bit. So I think 30 is going to work fine, and then I'm just going to hit bake, which is then going to take its time and calculate it depending on the size of your text, how many subdivisions there are, which is the remesh modifier and all that stuff. It might vary, but this shouldn't take too long to step, especially because it is only 30 frames. So now that that has been calculated, we can then go forward and we can see our text has deflated very nicely. We can play that back and that looks super awesome. So now we just want to go to the end of that simulation, which is 30 frames, so we can put here. And then if we go into our modifier tab, we'll just hover over the cloth modifier and then hit Control A again, which is going to apply it. So now we just have this flat little thing on the ground, which is our deflated balloon. Now we need to create the inflated state of this. Again, we are going to be using a cloth physics simulation thing, so we're going to add that to our text. And as you can see right now, it looks all weird because I added it while I was at the very end, like in the middle of our sequence. So if I go back to 0, it's going to go back. And this is one thing we do have to keep in mind, is when we adjust all of these things, it's best to do it at the very beginning so your computer doesn't lag and all that stuff, because otherwise it has to calculate everything up until that point. Here we are going to increase the quality steps just to make it a little bit more of a crispy animation, and then we're going to change both the stiffness and the damping. So for the stiffness, we are going to decrease it a little bit, and it kind of makes sense, you know, when you think about you want something to expand, we don't want it to be super stiff so that whatever pressure we put into it, whatever air we blow into it, it doesn't have too much resistance, which lets it inflate. And then we are also going to increase the bending just a little bit, so I'm just going to set that to something like 0.7, but again, play around with it. Damping is what you might think it is. If you think of like a spring, so how soft it kind of comes back. And here we're just going to decrease it a little bit so it's a bit springy in its animation, and then we are going to increase the bending to something like 1. What we are going to do here is scroll down to self collisions again, and we're going to input the same number as we did before. We're just going to set the distance to 0.0015, and then we're actually going to do something a little bit different this time. We are going to tab click with our text selected to go into edit mode, and now we can see all the vertices. We're just going to hit A to select everything, and then down here we're going to go to this little triangle here, and then we're going to add a vertex group, and then we want to make sure we hit assign, so that just assigns all these vertices to this group. And if we then go back into our physics tab and go into shape, and then we just want to select this group, and then we want to set the shrinking factor to a negative number. So instead of shrinking, it'll then do the opposite since it's a negative number. So we're just going to set that to negative 0.15, which is super nice. And then of course we need some sort of air to blow into this, which is going to be our pressure. You can think of this kind of like putting a balloon on a helium tank. So the pressure is the helium that blows up the balloon. And here we just want to set the pressure to something like 10. In some instances, it might be super nice to add a custom value, and then that'll just let you add a target volume so that it'll keep that pressure constantly. I usually set that to something like 8, which we're just going to do for this because that should definitely make sure that it works. It's not always necessary though. Now, if you just wanted everything to inflate at the same time, you'd be good to go right now, but we want to create a gradual look. To create that, we are going to add an empty. So again, I'm going to hit Shift A to open up our add menu, and then I'm going to go down to empty, and then I'm going to add a sphere. And I'm just going to scale this appropriately so that it covers the letters pretty nicely, and then I'm going to hit G to move it, and then I'm just going to hit X so it's only on the X-axis, and this will determine which direction your letters inflate from. So if you go to the left, it'll move that way, and if you go from the right, then you'll move the opposite way. I'm just going to put it right before my text, and then I'm going to select my text again. And we're going to go into the modifiers, and I'm actually going to hide this for now, just so we can see what we're doing. It's just, otherwise it would be way too render intensive. And then we are going to add another modifier, which is the vertex weight proximity. Now, in the vertex group, we're going to select the one we created just a minute ago, which is just this one. And then in the target object, we are going to select our empty or whatever else you created, what type of shape. You can use a square, pretty much anything, but sphere works pretty well. Then we want to change the proximity mode to geometry, and then at the very beginning we want to keyframe these two, and we want to set it to something very small like 0.2. Now if I go up here into object mode and just change it to weight paint, you can see it's all red, which means nothing has been covered, which is perfect. So we're just going to keyframe these two at the very beginning. And let's go forward to something, you don't want to go too far forward, but you also want to give it, it's a good mix of wanting to give it time to actually get the animation, but also have some breathing room in the end to actually see the inflated look. But we're just going to move forward, and then we're going to set them both to something like 10 and then 10.2. And we just want to make sure that everything turns dark blue. So you just want to play with this. Some instances, if you have a longer word, you'll have to increase the highest. You just want to make sure it's all covered. I'm just going to go up here and go back to object mode, and then I'm going to go back to the very beginning. And then I want to make sure that I drag the cloth below the vertex proximity, and then we can turn it back on. Now we are ready to essentially bake this animation that we just made. And in this case, you do want it over the whole timeline, just so you still get the interaction between the balloons and all that stuff. So they still float around a little bit and have some actual movement between them. But this step might take a long time depending on your computer and all that stuff. But I'm gonna bake it, and then we will see you at the other end of that. And don't forget to save before we start baking it. And my bake is over. So now if I play this back, we should have a nice little inflation animation. So I'm gonna hit spacebar, and just like that, we have our text inflating exactly how you want to. That is pretty much it for the animation itself. Now we just need to add a little bit of the sauce before we can go ahead and actually render it out. So as you see right now, it does look a little bit iffy with all the little pixels and whatnot. So what we can do is, if you go into the modifiers tab, we can add a subdivision surface, which is gonna smoothen it out just a little bit. You can increase that to maybe like 2 or something like that. Already seeing some nice changes to the texture here. You can also add a smooth modifier if you want to, which is an extra level of smoothing it. And then you can also right click and hit shade smooth, which is just gonna do an extra pass of smoothing, just make it look a little bit nicer. Now we need to set up some lights for this to make it look really spicy. So to do that, I'm gonna open up another scene so we can have a look at what it looks like with all the textures and all that, kind of like a preview of the rendered version, and just one we can play around with. If I go up to this corner where I have this plus icon, I can just click and drag, which will open up a second window. And then in this first window, I can just change it to a rendered view by clicking this little circle up here. So right now it just looks great. So I'm gonna go into the world, and there's a couple different ways you can light the scenes. You can use regular lights like we did in the previous Blender tutorial, but in this case, I just wanna use a skylight. So if I go to colors, I click this little yellow icon, I can go to a sky texture, and that'll create kind of like a sun. So now we can play around with what we want it to look like. And I'm just gonna click the Z button, which is gonna give me an overhead view. And then I'm just gonna play around with this a little bit. I like taking the sun down a good bit so it kind of looks like a sunset, which will give some really nice colors like the yellows, some nice shadows, and then rotate that a little bit so we get a nice angled shadow. Maybe the other way actually, like that, maybe. I think this looks pretty good. So if I go back over in this window where we can just play around, it's not rendered anything, I'm gonna hit Shift A, and I'm gonna add a camera, and then I'm gonna click the little camera button in the second window that is the rendered view so we can see what the camera sees. And if I just go into the properties of the camera, I can just change all of these to 0 just to make it a little bit easier, and just increase the Z so we lift it up above and then we look straight down. I think that looks pretty good in terms of the framing, maybe a little bit more so we have some room to play with and crop in and all that stuff. And then if I hit Control B, it'll give me this little marker where I can select a rendered region. So it doesn't render everything around it, which just helps save your computer a little bit of power. So I'm just gonna click and drag and create a little square or rectangle around what we actually want to see, and just make sure that everything is focused on that. So now we have this super nice little piece here, but we need to add some texture to it to really spice it up. And we want to create 2 separate textures. Now the way we're gonna do that is, let's start with just selecting the text and then going into this little material button here and just hit new. And then if I go in, click this little button up here and then go to shader editor, we can see the shader editor and we can see how we're gonna kind of create this. Like if I click the base color here, it'll change the color of everything. So if I set that to a nice yellow, kind of like this logo really is, everything just looks like that. But we are gonna add a mix shader node, which is just gonna let us mix 2 different colors, which is gonna be, one is gonna be our yellow and one is for the inflated, and the other one is gonna be like a clear transparent for our deflated. I am gonna add that in there, boom. And then we are gonna add a color ramp, which is just taken black and white values. We'll take the color into the FAC. Next step is going into our geometry node editor. And if we select our text here, and then in our modifiers tab, we are gonna add a geometry node modifier. So boom, right there. And then we're gonna hit plus, and that should give us a little geometry node in here that we can then add our attribute to. So I'm gonna hit Shift A, again, our add menu, and we're gonna add a capture attribute, and we're just gonna place it right in between. So we just hover and you see the green line going white. It just means that it'll automatically connect it for you. And then we're just gonna take this little gray icon, plug it into the value, and then the attribute into the output. And this is very important. We're gonna click this little value, this little input attribute toggle type thing, and then we're gonna click and set that to the vertex group. And then in the output attributes, we can just type in weight, which is gonna be the name of it, and then just click that to make sure that it is the plus. Now we can go back into our shader editor, and then we're gonna add a couple more things to this. So we are gonna add a attribute up here, and we're just gonna take this and connect it to our color ramp. And again, we're just gonna take the FAC and connect it with the FAC, and then in the name, we're then gonna type weight, which is what we selected. So now you see half of it turning black, which is perfect. It's using the color ramp to decide what value goes where. So now if we click over here and we just add another principled BDSF, which is going to be another color, and drag that into shader number 2, you can see the color of it now changes in the second part. This is where you can play around and get it to look exactly how you want. In my example, I just turned up the transmission to make it look kind of like a clear bubble, and decreased the roughness a little bit to make it look a little bit more shiny. You can increase the metallic a little bit to get it really, really shiny, and maybe add a slight bluish tint to it just to make it look a little bit more stylistic. And then all that's really left is doing anything you want to the background. You can add some camera movement to it already in Blender, but I like doing that in After Effects just because I'm a little bit more comfortable in there. But have at it, do whatever you want with the Blender cameras, all that stuff. For this specific example, I'm just going to leave it at a locked camera. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit to give me some room to work with. And After Effects, again, render this however you want. I do have a couple of tips in terms of how you can render it out and get it to look pretty sexy. If you don't want the background, you just select that and just remove that from the render view so you don't get it. And then you want to make sure you go into the camera in here, then go into film, and then enable transparency. So then you'll see a checkered background. But in my case, at least the example, I did have a background. I just added a little bit of texture to it. Just found one online from Polyhaven. Super nice. So I'm just going to remove that. But I will go into color management, and you can play around with whatever you want. So in my instance, I have this Aces one that I also covered in the previous video. That will be linked up in the corner and down below. But essentially just play around with that. And then for the render settings themselves, I like to use, per recommendation, I like to use OpenEXR. Change that to a DWAB. DWAB, I don't know how you pronounce it, but that one. And then if you are rendering without a background, so transparent, you want to say RGBA. And if you don't have a background, you can just be fine with RGB. But that's pretty much it. And then of course, samples, like I mentioned earlier, play around with it. I like to go to render and then render image and then see what it actually looks like at that set amount of samples. So I had it at 200. And if that looks fine, I'll just go with that. But sometimes I might want to increase it if it's something more detailed. Sometimes I'm fine with decreasing it as well. Just kind of depends on how much detail is in whatever you're making and kind of what looks good and what doesn't. But get that rendered out and then we can go into After Effects. So in After Effects, I've opened up the actual project file from the animation that I did just so you can get an insight into how I like to add a little bit of camera movement in there. And it's actually super simple. I started out with the same as what we just made, just a basic render with no camera movement at all. And then I just added a couple of different keyframes, and you can see here I used the time remapping. I like doing that just so I have more control over the tempo of everything and I can just change it around a little bit. But essentially what I did was add a couple of adjustment layers to add a little bit of camera movement. So you can see here in the beginning we have some left and right movement just to give it some initial movement that kind of feels like it makes sense with the inflation as well. So you can see they both go kind of, it feels like it's cohesive, like the way that it's kind of being drawn attention to. And then I have a cut where it's just a slight zoom in on the second one, and I've zoomed in a whole bunch, but it doesn't matter too much with all the texture that the quality isn't 100% there, especially because it is so quick. But then to help sell the animation a little bit, I've added some focus breathing, which is just an adjustment layer with a fast box blur on there, and then I've just keyframed the blur radius so that we get a little bit of blur, and it just helps sell the transition a little bit. I really like doing some close-ups and then adding the wide angle at the end, And to transition to that, I just added a very simple scale animation. So just a little scale out, which kind of functions as a match cut with a little bit of movement there. But that is pretty much it in terms of just adding some camera movement to it and really spicing it up. You don't have to overthink it and make it way too complex. Now, the thing that is gonna help sell this a whole bunch is sound design, which is the last step. But before we get into that, I just wanna talk a little bit about today's video sponsor, Artlist. All that sweet music that has been playing in the background, Artlist. All the cool sound effects you've been hearing throughout, the sound effects I used in the intro piece, Artlist. I legit use Artlist for both all my client work and all my personal work just because it is that good. And you might be thinking, why Artlist compared to all these other music platforms? And well, it's just because they have everything. They don't only have music or sound effects. They also have stock footage, they have plugins, they have templates, they have everything you could possibly think of in your video creation. So it just makes a lot more sense to have one thing that has everything than 7 different things to keep track of. The best part of it is that it's all extremely high quality and created by really, really talented individuals. They also have a variety of different plans. So if you don't need stock footage, they have a plan where you can just have music or sound effects, or even just one with just music, which makes it super easy for you as a consumer or customer or creative to just get exactly what you need without having to pay extra for something you don't even need. And even down the line, if you, like me, started out with just the music one and then you need the sound effects one to spice up your animations, then you can just add that to your subscription, and it makes it so much easier because you're already familiar with the platform. Most importantly, the licensing is amazing, and that was one of the reasons I actually picked out Artlist in the first place. I wanted something that I could use not only in my personal project, but also for clients without having to worry about getting them in trouble. Artlist just made that super easy with their licensing. They had different prices for different types of licenses, where Artlist is just super simple. And as an editor or an animator, or just a creative in general, it's your job to make sure that you don't use something that'll get your client in trouble. Also, a quick recommendation, the jazz and classical sections in the music section are absolutely phenomenal. By far my 2 favorite ones, especially if you pair it with the acoustic as well. That's pretty much where I find all my music for the videos. With that being said, it's definitely worth exploring all the other genres and categories that they have on there. If you are looking for stock footage though, they have this super cool AI search feature that essentially analyzes video clips, so it makes it a lot easier for you to find exactly what you're looking for. It essentially takes whatever it sees in the video and writes out a little segment about it to make it easier to search for complex concepts, and it even helps with the sound effect matcher, which essentially looks at clips and recommends sounds that fit with it using that same model. Anyways, use the link in my description to get 2 free months when you sign up for the annual subscription. And with that being said, we can finally actually start sound designing. So we're gonna head to Artlist and look for some sounds that would fit our project. So I've dragged in my little video clip into Davinci Resolve just because that's where I like doing my sound designing. It's a lot easier than doing it in After Effects. And I have my trusty Apple earbud in for top quality sound design listening. But essentially here, we have a couple things that I know I want to look for. So we have the initial inflation and just in general inflation that I of course want some balloon sound effects for. I also want some swoosh for that intro bit. I think will look pretty cool, and maybe a little bit of like an impact for when this match cut happens, so we can have an impact right there. And then we have the little hand-drawn element here that I want to add a little bit of scribbles for. And I think that would probably look pretty good. And then maybe some ambient noise as well. So add a couple different layers to make it feel full and not just like it's, well, an animation. Let's start with the inflation. So I'm going to head to Artlist here that I have opened up at the sound effects tab, just nice and easy. And all I'm going to do here is just type in balloon and see what we get. And then it's just about listening. So I think this one is pretty good, and it looks like I already have it downloaded once, which must means I probably either used it in the original one or used it for something else. This one is perfect as well. Sounds kind of like a person touching balloons, which is sick. So we'll download those 2, and let's just go back into Davinci Resolve and let's drag those in there. So I'm going to start with this one. That's this long one, and we're just going to have this not before the balloon is actually shown, but I think right here we can start having that. So move that up a little bit and let's play that back. I think that's pretty good. And then I'm just going to cut it right here because no balloons are really moving after that point. So it wouldn't make sense to have a sound where nothing is moving. But I think that's a pretty good little background texture sound, and just decrease the volume of it a little bit. And we can take our actual inflation in there as well, and let's have it start right there where our balloon is starting to inflate. So I'm just going to drag that up, and one little trick I like to turn off the snapping. It's just going to make it a bit easier to place the sounds where we actually want them. So maybe move that up a little bit, just because it takes it a little bit of time to actually get into it. Actually, maybe move that. So that is pretty good, the timing of it. I might actually, right here where it cuts, I might cut the effect and then trim it up a little bit, just because it is a cut in time, so it doesn't go from the T to the T, it goes kind of to the E and the R. So by cutting it, we can kind of fake it like cutting in time as well, which might add just a little bit more detail to the animation. And then we want it to cut right there as well. That'll be the end of that. I think that's super sweet already. So that is pretty much it for like the balloon sounds, and you saw how easy that was to find sounds. Like, you just put it in and there's so many good sounds to pick from. So now let's find the swoosh for the initial intro here, and we're just gonna go back into my browser, and let's just search for a swoosh. I'm just gonna make it super easy, and we're just gonna listen to a couple of them. I think this one might be pretty nice. I like when they have a little bit of fullness to them, so they're not just like super squeaky sounding. Like that one is a bit too, it sounds a bit too fast, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but I'm gonna drag that in here and let's see what we can do with that. So let's have that right here, coming in. That looks pretty good. I'm just gonna decrease the volume of it a little bit, and let's play that back. Maybe move it over just one frame. I actually think that's super nice. I might decrease the volume of it just a little bit more, so it's a little more subtle, not as overpowering. Oh yeah, that's super sweet. We might, I think I want to make it just a little bit deeper sounding, so I'm just going to move the semitones down to like -2, just to add a little bit more bass, I suppose, or whatever you would call that. And it just makes it sound a lot more full. And then I want like a little cut right here. A good sound for cut, maybe like a clicky type of sound, or like a pop or something like that. I think maybe a click would be a better term to describe it with. Oh yeah, I like that one. That would make a lot of sense as well for the kind of out of focus bit as well, because it's kind of like a camera focusing in a little bit. So that actually makes a whole bunch of sense. I actually really like that. So we're just gonna use my arrow keys here to go right to where it cuts. And we're gonna zoom in a little bit, and let's just move that. Let's put that right there. Maybe actually move it over just a little bit more, like that. Oh yeah, that's sweet. I'm just going to decrease the volume of that, and then decrease the lower the semitones, or whatever the technical term for that is. Actually increase the volume just a little bit more. Oh yeah, that's sweet. Just a little bit, like right in between what we had it. Oh yeah, that's so good. And it's just such a little subtle sound that just adds the tiniest bit of more emphasis. Now we need a nice impact sound for this. Like, I'm thinking real bassy, and it's going to be as easy as just searching for impact, and that should give us something pretty sick. Definitely don't want something that's alien sci-fi. I like this one, but I think it might just be a little bit too punchy. So I'm just gonna click the similar sounds to see if there's something really good that sounds kind of similar in terms of it, how airy it is without the punch. Hold on. Oh yeah, I think that's pretty sick. Might try this one. Sometimes it is a bit of trial and error just to see if it hits as hard as you think it does. But I like adding a whole bunch of sounds and then just creating a little library that way. But cuts right here, so I'm just gonna move the impact to be at its loudest right when that happens. Decrease that a little bit. Maybe move it over just a couple more frames. Oh yeah, that's super sweet. So now all we really need to do is just a nice, I think I want to find another like super bass sound. So I'm just going to type in bass as well to add to that search and see if we can get something. I think this one might be the best. And I mean, I already have it once and I know it just, especially if you have a subwoofer, this goes so hard. Like it just shakes up the room. That's how good it is. And it's great to add as like another element to an impact because it's kind of it's different frequencies. So it just adds another layer to the sound. I'm just gonna drag this up a little bit so we can see how it sound a little bit nicer. So right there, let's move that to be right there. Oh yeah. That's so good. And now we just need it for the little hand-drawn element. So let's just type in, maybe marker would be pretty good to find something. I think this one is super, super solid. And we might even just be able to use one sound for kind of both the movements of both the setup and the line going through it. I'm just going to add that in there and let's pick a small part and I'm just going to trim that up real quick. Boom. And let's go to where that comes in. So right there, let's just add it to this layer up here so we kind of keep it as condensed as we can. Maybe decrease it a little bit because it's probably going to be a bit too loud. Oh yeah, that's so sweet. Maybe one over. Oh, that's awesome. That is perfect. And now I just kind of want like an ambient sound, something that can sit in the background and just give it a little bit of ambiance. And a super easy way to do that is just thinking about what kind of feel, like do you want it to be kind of like dark or do you like ethereal or what do you feel like? I like finding a lot of like random sounds that I think make sense, like this airliner ambiance, which is just kind of like a windy, turbulent sound, but it's just super subtle. It's in the lower frequencies, I think you would call that, like the bass type of things. So it just gives it like a super subtle feel that there's something more than, you know, just nothing. So I just wanted to kind of give it a feel, like a vibe. So I'm adding that, and let's just play that back. That's perfect. And you can see how that sound just adds a little bit of that. There's really no better word to explain than ambiance. It feels like it's in an actual room where there's actual stuff going on. And I just think that just adds so much to it. Just makes it feel like it's really part of something. But that is pretty much it for a quick little sound design session. This one was super easy, especially because you have something like balloons, which is just so characteristic. I just want to say thank you for watching. Again, thank you to Artlist for sponsoring this video. Again, you can use the link in the description if you want to get 2 free months when signing up for the annual subscription. And if you want the project file for this, it'll be available on the Patreon as well, so you can always have fun with that. And hopefully you learned something new, hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully you create something with this effect and tag me in it so I can see it. But yeah, just want to say thank you, like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.